Good morning. Thank you for joining Armanino today for our webinar, Financial Best Practices for Diocesan Parishes and Schools. All right, first we'd like to start with how to use your webinar pane. So in the upper right-hand corner of your screen, you'll see a small orange arrow. To expand the box, just click on that orange arrow, and you'll have the opportunity to type in a question for our staff, and we will answer those questions as time allows at the end of the webinar. And as you've logged into our webinar, please make sure that you've selected the correct audio settings. If you're using your computer, choose the mic and speakers. If you've called in by phone, use the phone option. This will eliminate any echoing from our audio broadcast. And to qualify for CPE today, you must make sure that you're using a personal computer, no smartphones, and log in with your own information and unique URL. Be logged into our online software for at least 50 consecutive minutes within the scheduled time frame of the webinar. Actively respond to at least 75% of the polling questions, and complete the evaluation survey at the end of the webinar. With that, I'd like to have our presenters introduce themselves. So, Eric.
Hi, this is Eric. I've been with Armanino for about 4 years. After spending about 15 years in the private sector running large organizations, I now help nonprofits and startups right-size their accounting department by providing an outsourced solution using cloud-based accounting technology.
And my name is Mike Bolton. I'm a partner with Armanino in our audit practice, and I specialize in working with nonprofit organizations of varying sizes and varying sectors, but I have a particular passion for working with organizations such as yours, diocesan parishes and schools, and helping you through various accounting needs and internal control best practices, which we'll talk through today. So excited to go through that with you.
Hello, everyone. I'm Dean Kiambau. Very happy to be here as well on this webinar. Definitely passionate about the Catholic organizations, diocesan parishes, and churches. I am a product of De La Salle High School in Concord, California, the infamous, I should say. I will say right now, I am a big guy, but I did not play football, so you can't hold that against me. So with that said, thank you, everyone, for joining us today. We'll jump into our learning objectives. And these are probably the only slides that we'll read here today, but since we have to do it for CPE, we'll identify the most common internal control findings at diocesan parishes and schools. We'll discuss best practice internal controls, and we'll determine how to prioritize implementing those controls. We know that I think at the end of this, you could be sitting there feeling like you're going to drink from the fire hose. And we want to give you a plan on how to best start with. I just taught my daughter this last night. She's 8 years old. We learned the definition of low-hanging fruit. So we're going to capitalize on that today. All right, quickly, who is Armanino? If you don't know who we are, 23rd largest CPA firm and consulting firm in the country, over 1,000 employees. What matters to most to everybody on the line today is that we work with over 700 nonprofits, and in that, we work with over 150 diocesan parishes and schools. We are a very large CPA firm with offices here in the San Francisco Bay Area, Los Angeles, Dallas, Naperville, and so many more that we seem to be growing like crazy. And this is a niche that we really believe in, we're passionate about, and we like to serve. And a lot of that really resounds on the fact that we understand that diocesan schools and parish business offices really, rely on part-time bookkeepers, limited headcount, constrained resources. We get that. So we really want to help you guys not be a target of fraud, and really the errors that are commonly made, fix those, because it's really important, to take the time to identify your risk and take the right action to implement best practice and protect yourself, protect your organization, protect your donor base, all of that. So with that said, you see the list here, the most common internal control findings. When we do those diocesan parish site visits, when we do those diocesan school reviews, these are the areas that are hot topics: governance, cash, budgeting, accounting, record keeping, and the new one, cybersecurity. Right? it's new now, but it's been around for a while. I think now it's just getting larger and larger by the day. So with that said, let's jump into it. Mike and Eric, governance.
Yeah, Dean, and I'll add maybe for the audience, of course, we're going to talk a lot about internal controls. We're also going to talk about, again, to Dean's point, what are the low-hanging fruits, some easy wins, maybe not true controls, but just a best practice. You'll hear us talk about some record keeping, ultimately to help protect the organization, but also to help you have accurate records, accurate financial records, so you can make sound operating decisions. But before we jump into some of those areas, what we wanted to start was with governance topics. And I think this is a great place to start because you'll probably hear us mention a few times throughout this morning, having an appropriate discipline within your organization. And what we mean by that is having a culture that emphasizes the importance of these types of activities. And really that starts at the top. It starts with appropriate tone at the top, at the governance level of the organization. So asking yourselves, does the board, the finance committee, the principal, the pastor, do they set the tone for these to be implemented? Do they emphasize the importance of these types of activities within the organization? So great place to start. What we want to do is really just highlight a couple of key findings that we've seen, opportunities for improvement. Some of these are pretty straightforward and some we'll elaborate on. So first and foremost, low-hanging fruit by all means, formal meeting minutes. So what we mean by that is we'll go into a parish or a school and talk about their committee meetings, pastoral council meetings, and we uncover that there are no documented meeting minutes. We understand that that's the easy route, but it's really important to document those meeting minutes, retain them in files, ultimately so there's a record, a breadcrumb trail of decisions that have been made in the past so that you can revert back to those. Adhering to set terms. So again, at the board or the committee level, oftentimes it's best practice to have rotating chairpersons, rotating committees as a whole every 2 years, 3 years, so on. Very important to have that discipline to follow those set terms. And we understand that's a challenge. Committees are volunteers, members of the community, but important to reach out to community members to get fresh eyes, fresh ideas within those committees and boards. Authorized signers on auxiliary bank accounts. This is a very important one. Many schools have auxiliary groups such as parent-teacher associations. Parishes might have altar societies. Other groups that are out in the community on behalf of the parish or the school, they may have a bank account to fund various activities or raise monies on behalf of the organization. And it's very important that there is control around those bank accounts, that there's proper authorized signers. So at the parish level, the pastor should be a signer on all bank accounts, whether the core operating account or any auxiliary group as well. Same goes for the school, for those PTA accounts, very important. Operating cash reserves, we put here 2 months. That's just one rule of thumb. It's a very debated topic on what the right number is. So we want to focus more on just the fact of having operating cash reserves. And that's a challenge with diocesan parishes and schools. But we like to encourage them to start thinking about their liquidity needs, and whether that be a 2-month reserve, a 3-month, a 6-month, obviously the greater the better. But start thinking about what you need. Make it an emphasis for a particular year when you have that flexibility to start setting aside those dollars to get you through the tougher times.
Mike, you listed 2 months, and there is no magic number, but I would say this is a leading indicator of a well-run, tightly controlled organization. Focusing on that operating cash reserve and making sure you've got the adequate liquid cash to run your organization.
Absolutely. Taking that next step, that next level as a business office.
And, when you talk about that, when you talk about with your board, and I'm a recent private school, St. Mary's School, Walnut Creek board member, this is something that gives everybody some comfort, right? If you let everybody know, hey, this is where we are, it's basically getting the basics done, and then you can start focusing on other things. But once you give everybody that basic level of comfort, then you're good to keep moving on.
Absolutely. So next, formal written evaluations, and what we're getting at here is personnel, human resource side of things. Oftentimes that's handled by an administrator at the school or the parish who has a number of different hats they're wearing. And we really encourage parishes and schools to have that discipline on at least an annual basis to document employee performance evaluations, retain them in employee files. This is to protect the organization, to have that appropriate documentation in case there is an unfortunate employee who leaves, and there's no ambiguity on their performance. It also is for good reason. If someone's doing well, document what they're excelling at, and it's warranted for potential compensation changes. So very important to have that discipline. Tuition assistance. This is a common one that we see at schools, particularly those with a parish attached to them, which is most common. That the tuition assistance decisions for families attending the school are made solely by the business manager and the principal, perhaps. And we really encourage the parish pastor to be involved in those tuition assistance decisions. They're a key member of the community at large. They often have a great understanding of the families who are attending both the school and the parish, and have valuable input into tuition assistance decisions.
Mike, we're seeing more organizations kind of take that decision off to, some kind of third-party organization. Or give us some thoughts on that real quick.
Yeah, I think that's obviously great. It offloads some of the initial administrative burden of evaluating families' needs, financial needs. I always encourage to use that as a tool, not as the sole decision. Use that as a tool to collect information and data, and then refine the population that you're looking at providing awards to, and make decisions based on your own knowledge of the community. Lastly, really quick, fundraising activities. Maybe simpler, a very simple topic, but sometimes we'll come into a parish or a school and they're really not doing much in the way of fundraising. Maybe the occasional magazine drive, but really encouraging them to think like a business. These are supplemental income sources, and parents, families are willing to give when they're asked the appropriate way and have the right opportunity.
And part of that is I'm the advancement chair at my kids' diocesan school, and part of that is having everybody understand that there is in private education there is a fundamental tuition gap, and maybe identifying what that means and educating the donor base and the parent group on what that looks like for your school or for your parish, and how much the gap needs to be bridged through different measures.
And to kind of recap this, I would say all of these would be considered low-hanging fruit because they're effort-based. These all require some effort, but they will give you that sweat equity that creates a culture of governance, not just convenience.
Absolutely. Again, I mentioned at the beginning, we'll talk about this a lot, culture over convenience. We understand the resource constraints that you all face that Dean mentioned, and we really want to encourage you to think hard about those convenience items and really change the culture to emphasizing some of these control matters and implement some of these activities. And a couple easy ways you can start to do that, start to use your resources at large, leverage board members, committee members. They have valuable knowledge. They're also added bodies to help accomplish some of these goals, to perform reviews and approvals, and we'll talk about some examples of that later. Segregating duties we'll talk about as well, but important to keep in mind it doesn't always have to be an accountant. You can look outside of the accounting function to help segregate some of the duties. We'll give some more examples as we get through that.
Yeah, and lastly, once again, an effort-based item. Document these controls and review annually. Documentation's hard. There's always something more pressing to do, but it's really important because it'll help immensely with the overall control environment and turnover. It gives the new people a place to start. It gives guiding principles for them to follow when they start. And once you do document it, a binder on the shelf doesn't help. You need to review it annually. Unread words are not valuable, but if you establish a monthly calendar or annual calendar of review, update if needed, but just reinforce those controls, you'll have a lot of success.
And we know that a lot of the employees at diocesan parishes and schools are there because they love the organization, which means that they're there for a long time. How many times have we seen, so-and-so bookkeeper who's been there for 20 years, for 25 years, and they know what they do and they know the organization better than anyone else. But God forbid something happened to that person, right? Especially we know that, hey, pastors turn over, principals turn over. But the staff, they really know what's going on. So to the extent that we can document that goes a long way.
All right, and we're going to have our first polling question here. So make sure that you log in your response so that you can get that CPE credit. And the question we have for you is, having heard all of that, how confident are you in your own internal control environment? Are you confident, somewhat confident, or not confident at all? So we'll give you a few seconds here to respond to that question and look for your answers. And I think we've got good news here in some of the responses. So let's go ahead and we'll close that poll and share the results with you. So it appears that the majority are confident or somewhat confident. What do you guys think of that?
Yeah, that's great. About half and half. Those of you that are already confident in what you're doing, hopefully what we've started discussing and continue to go through here will help validate for you what you're doing well. Those of you that are somewhere in the middle, again, hopefully some new ideas for you and still validating what you're already doing to continually improve. So the next topic we want to talk about is cash, and this is everything. This is extremely important topic. We'll talk about the cash incoming to the organization as well as the cash outgoing from the organization. But this is where we as auditors focus a lot of our time. And as you already know, parish collections, school tuition, that's the sole source of funding for the organization. So we want to make sure that this is tightly guarded and tightly protected, and we want to help give you some ideas for that. So first, we'll talk about some of the common deficiencies or areas for improvement that we see both on the parish and the school side as we go through the cycle of collecting cash, collecting it, counting it, and depositing it. So first, as we collect cash, the typical transaction at the parish of the mass collection process and getting that ready for counting and depositing, we occasionally see that this is handled by one person. Maybe the sacristans collect the collections from the community, and then they're placed into a bag by one individual and moved from the sacristy to the parish office safe by one individual. Wherever possible, we want to see that done by two individuals. Also, pre-numbered bags. Sometimes we're still seeing some parishes not using pre-numbered collection bags, and that's very important. We'll talk about some key reasons for that. But even more importantly, if you're using those pre-numbered bags, it's extremely important to then think about the sequencing of those bags and doing what we call a detective control after the fact to make sure that the bags were ultimately that were collected, counted, and deposited, that none went missing. So there needs to be that second step involved of checking the actual numbering of those bags used. Access to the safe, we'll talk a little bit about later as well, but in the sacristy safe, making sure that that's restricted to only those who are authorized and most needed, not available to everybody within the organization. And next we'll talk about the counting process once those bags have been collected, available for counting, some of the common deficiencies we see there.
Yeah, what we often see there is that the count sheets are not consistently signed. We see that there's only one count team. Occasionally the count teams have familial relations. We have several count sheets and deposit totals that didn't have any bag tags attached to it. And then sometimes the count teams don't maintain a separate tally for each collection. It's a big aggregate, which is not good. Lastly, the cash and checks received in the parish office often aren't counted and deposited by the collection team at all.
And then on the depositing process, again, like I mentioned with the collecting of bags, we want that to be within the hands of two people at least at all times. We're seeing some parishes and schools as well who may be collecting miscellaneous checks from families, taking that deposit after it's been counted to the bank by themselves, one individual. Obviously, it's a fraud risk. In the unfortunate situation, there's someone with ill intent, but it's also to protect that individual. If they're taking a large deposit from a weekend mass, a series of masses, we don't want them to be susceptible to anything inappropriate there, driving or walking to the bank. So important to have two individuals with them during that process. Restrictively endorsing those checks once they're counted, as Eric described, making sure that is done before the funds are taken to the bank and deposited, since those are still live currency before they're officially deposited. we're still seeing the restrictive endorsement not being handled appropriately. And after the deposit is made, we want to see appropriate review of that deposit, like I mentioned, not only to evaluate the pre-numbering of bags, but also once the count sheet was prepared, was that the dollar amount that was ultimately deposited in the bank? And there needs to be that detective control after the fact to ensure that all the funds collected and counted ultimately were deposited in the bank.
Yeah, and as always, you want evidence of your review. It doesn't help you or your organization if you're doing the review but not evidencing it. So once we get the cash in, it's safe, it's secure, we also have to be controlling and serious about the disbursements. And those disbursements are usually written through checks. What we see there is that often there are gaps in the check register due to avoided checks, unrecorded checks, or just simply out of sequence. The safe, as Mike was saying, needs to be very secure. For example, the bookkeeper should not have access to the safe. We see that dual signatures aren't always enforced, or if they are, not consistently. And then a big no-no is that the checks are just written to cash. Unless Johnny Cash is a member and he's performing, he should not be writing to cash.
That's right.
Another big one, bookkeeper is an authorized check signer. We want to keep that control away from them, or that access away from them. And then lastly, we got to keep the principal in line too. There should be a board review of the principal's credit card expenditures, and often we don't see that.
Yeah, and that's a great one that we alluded to earlier, using other members of the organization, the finance committee or the board. Sometimes we're seeing a principal or pastor expenses reviewed by the bookkeeper, and ideally we want that to go upward through the hierarchy of the organization. And there's nothing wrong with asking the finance committee member to review those expenditures. And it doesn't need to be real time. That's an administrative burden. They can review them monthly, quarterly if they have to. Find the right, the match of time for the volume of transactions, but it's important that those be reviewed.
So, Mike, one thing we see pushback on is the bookkeeper access to the safe. Why shouldn't they have access to the safe?
Yeah, it's important, as we talk about proper segregation of duties within an organization, ultimately no one individual should have access or custody of cash, the authority to sign checks and issue cash or funds out of the organization, while also maintaining the ability to transact in the accounting system. We want to segregate those duties wherever possible. We understand, of course, that's tough within a diocesan parish or school due to resource constraints. So one of the easy ways to start segregating those duties is safe access. And it's not uncommon. We see the parish office or the school office safe. There's only one. It holds check stock. It holds baptismal records, for example, and it also holds the deposit before it's taken to the bank. And that's why the bookkeeper has access to that safe, because they need some of those other records, such as the check stock. So we try to encourage the school, the parish, to move that check stock into a locked cabinet or a locked drawer in the office, or buy another small safe that can be used. Not have the bookkeeper have access to the actual cash before it's been deposited. Other items we talked about that we want to share with you for cash disbursements on the check side, dual signers. We always want to recommend that there be a policy of 2 signatures on a check over a certain dollar threshold that's relevant for the organization, whether it be $1,000, $3,000, $5,000. But again, having that discipline to always require having that second signer. Sometimes there's an inappropriate reliance on the bank that they'll enforce that. And we've seen checks clear the bank with no signature at all. We've seen checks clear the bank certainly with only one check signer, because they're not in the business of enforcing your own internal control. So that's a discipline thing. It's a culture thing that we want to encourage you all to enforce constantly.
Yeah, we really can't emphasize, as you all know, how important it is to have your cash secured. So here we're going to just briefly recap what we feel are some very important best practices that we've covered, but we just want to emphasize again. So the magic number for your counters is 2. Rotate those counters. We don't want to give people too much opportunity. It's just best practice to know, for the counters to know that other people are counting the cash as well. And then have them commit. Use ink signatures. Very often we see that people want to use pencil because they may make a mistake and may need to erase it. We would say start over. If you have a mistake, use ink, commit to that count, and sign it in ink.
Yeah, or in other words, if you've counted the funds and you know the dollar amount, make sure it's right before you write it on the count sheet. It's going to be in ink. That's important. We still do see fairly frequently count sheets prepared in pencil, signed in pencil, or not signed at all.
Yeah. So keep your check stock locked. We see a lot of organizations mitigating their check stock risk by using a cloud bill pay service such as bill.com, which enables you to greatly reduce your need for check stock. Again, require 2 signatures and educate your signers to not endorse or sign any checks that are written to cash.
Yeah, and I'll add, Eric, sometimes we get the question of, on the check signer side of things, the burden it is on the organization to always physically sign those checks. Can we just use a stamp, order a stamp of our signature so that we can have whoever the appropriate administrative person stamp those checks as they're ready to be issued each week? And, we of course would not encourage that. That's a risk for the organization to be inappropriately used. And the reality is, our take on this is diocesan parishes and schools are not so voluminous in checks being issued throughout the year that it creates an administrative burden. Take the time to physically sign checks, review the invoices, the related documentation before that check is signed and before you actually pay that vendor.
Yeah, so these are all great prevention controls. And then we need a couple detect controls as well. So reconcile all those cash accounts monthly. Have someone review the check register that isn't a check writer or signer. And then again, make sure there's a board review of your principal's expense reports.
Yeah, and as you review those check registers, I like to encourage parishes and schools that I work with, think a little bit like an auditor. What we do when we look at a disbursement listing or a check register for a month or a year is we start looking down the names of the payees. Is there a payee that says cash? Okay, well, that may have been a check that was issued to cash that shouldn't have been. Are there payee names that just look unusual, that are infrequent in nature, individual names that aren't members of the organization or the community, even dollar amounts, odd dates? So there can be a great detective control if the pastor or the principal takes 15 minutes once a month, once a quarter to review the check listing for any unusual items. Ask questions of your bookkeeper, helps you understand the organization better.
Okay, so this is tactical. It's right there. So now we're going to take a longer term look to best practices and controls. First up is budgeting. So our most common findings is that people budget a loss for their organization. They may not have a 5-year plan, or if they did, it's not updated. Their plan and budget may not include capital expenditures. And then finally, auxiliary programs are often operated and budgeted at a net loss.
Yeah, Eric, we see these opportunities for improvement fairly frequently across the board. We understand it. Budgeting losses is somewhat of a debatable topic that we've had. We understand the reasoning sometimes. As accountants, we try to encourage parishes and schools to have a stretch goal, a budget, a slight surplus, and then stretch to hit those fundraising numbers or manage those expenses. In the end of the day, the goal of the parish or the school should be to realize a reasonable surplus to sustain operations for the long term, so you can continue to deliver your mission and continue to serve your community.
Yeah, I agree. We understand that in reality there may be a loss, but that just shows why the 5-year plan is so vital, because that can serve as a roadmap to get from your planned loss for this year to a gain, small gain, efficient operating status within 5 years. And if you don't have that roadmap, where are you at? What long-term, what changes are you going to make to either manage costs or increase tuition or contributions to get you out of that loss position?
Yeah, absolutely. We see all the time parishes and schools are not yet in the habit of having that culture of thinking long-term on paper, with a documented 3-year, 5-year plan. Again, just like the liquidity or operating reserves, it doesn't have to be 5 years. It can be 2 years or 3 years, but getting in the habit of thinking long-term to turn around certain expenditures or fundraising efforts like Eric alluded to. Ultimately, that long-term plan should turn to a surplus.
And this is a great opportunity to involve your school and parish treasurers. They're on your board. They're invested in your success. They can help. You want their buy-in on this budget. You should use a standard budget template across the diocese. It makes it easier at the diocesan level. That way your school or parish does not have to recreate or create from scratch a budget.
Yeah, absolutely.
There should be tools at the diocese level to help you be successful here.
Absolutely. And certainly using those treasurers or other members of the finance committee or board, they have a wealth of knowledge, oftentimes with for-profit backgrounds, and they can help with new ideas. They can help, again, instill that discipline of proper budgeting and adhering to a budget. Maybe they have ideas on capital expenditures and funding a repair and replace fund that you can bake into your long-term plan, so you can be sure you have reserves available for when those unfortunate situations come up when a significant capital expenditure is required.
Okay, thank you. We're going to launch our next polling question here. Okay, is your board treasurer involved in your organization's internal controls? And your options are yes, somewhat, and no. So we'll gather up your responses here. Okay, we're going to give it a couple more seconds. We appreciate everyone paying attention and giving us your thoughts here. Okay, and with that, we're going to go ahead and close the poll.
Okay, so we've got a mixed bag. We've got 38% yes, 40% somewhat, and 23% no. I think this is again, low-hanging fruit. Reach out to your board treasurer, get them involved, and invested in your internal control structure.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, next topic, accounting. We want to talk about some of the nitty-gritty accounting. We've talked some bigger picture controls around protecting your cash, governance level at the committee level, but let's face it, accounting is time intensive. It's a burden, and we want to share with you some of the challenges we've seen parishes and schools face. So Eric, let's go through some examples of what we've seen, maybe starting with journal entries, some issues you've seen there.
Sure. We see transactions posted directly to net assets. This causes a misstatement to income and expenses. We see general ledger accounts that are not in compliance with the diocesan chart of accounts. This will often lead to beginning net assets that do not tie to prior year ending net assets. We'll often see missing liabilities, such as employee and sick vacation time. And often the parish does not accrue unearned but unpaid vacation payable at year end. We can see reporting temporarily restricted net assets commingled with unrestricted net assets. Records can be kept at home, often with the bookkeeper or other person. Loan balances don't agree with the diocesan statement. Conflict of interest in that the bookkeeper can also serve as a parish finance committee chairperson. Sometimes the bank accounts just aren't reconciled, or if they are reconciled, we see them not tying to the balance sheet amount.
Or potentially significantly aged outstanding checks just roll forward month after month on that bank reconciliation. You know, overall, I think you would agree a lot of these sound like that convenient side. It's a burden to adjust some of these old balances or clear off outstanding checks or put a vacation liability on the balance sheet. But it's important. It's part of the culture that should be instilled within the parish or the school. You know, ultimately, when I see balance sheets that don't have a liability for vacation, for example, it's a challenge for the pastor or the principal to really make sound financial decisions. They don't know the true liquidity position of the organization. So it's an important thing that can be done to help create good decisions.
Yeah, you know, to add to the variance from the diocesan chart of accounts, we can see this just go haywire, and then the organization is trying to use a 4-page statement of activities, and it's just really hard to make good informed decisions when there's that much information. It's more of a detailed listing of your activity than it is a summary of what's important to your organization.
Absolutely. Another one that you mentioned that hit home with me that I see frequently is those accounts that aren't reconciled with the diocesan side. So if there is a loan from the diocese, or if the parish or the school has investments or reserves held with the diocese, those balances aren't necessarily trued up on the parish or the school's books. Again, it's an added task to go get those statements from the diocese sometimes, or to book those general journal entries to true them up, but very important so that your books are accurate, they're reliable for your finance committee to review, and those governing the organization and make good decisions. The bookkeeper may know what those balances are, but it's important that their records reflect them as well.
And to circle it all always back to cash, the one last thing we see is that schools don't always have all their bank accounts on their general ledger. They may open a new bank account and just forget to include it. It misrepresents their financial position.
Yeah, absolutely. We talked about that earlier with the auxiliary groups. Even if what we mentioned before is even if they're on the books, do you have appropriate governance and check signers on them? But sometimes we do see those bank accounts are opened by a fundraising group, for example, and they're not consolidated, so to speak, on the school's balance sheet, and that's important. They're out there in the community acting on your behalf, fundraising on your behalf, and you need to have that cash included on the balance sheet to have a good picture.
So what do we do, Mike?
Yeah, we've talked about some of those deficiencies, some easy wins to implement, but let's talk about a few more ideas. Particularly around the power of when you do have sound budgets. Are you trending those? Are you tracking them against actuals? Eric can share a little bit about that.
Yeah, it's so important to review these monthly, because if you go against your budget and you go against trend, it's going to catch any errors, be they intentional or unintentional, because your organization doesn't change a lot. So typically you should be able to see if there's a variance against the budget or the trend. It's worth investigating. You can resolve it and be able to explain it to your board and your constituents.
Because ultimately, right, the budget's a baseline. And if you have a sound baseline as you track actuals, you can easily identify anomalies, one-time events to be able to articulate to the greater group.
Yeah, and once you get those periods closed, lock them up. It's correct, lock it. It'll prevent changes to those closed years and prior periods. Those changes are often unintentional. People just accidentally select the wrong date, or we see it cross periods where they pay a check in July for a June expense, or they may void a check. And a lot of the accounting softwares we see parishes and schools using, if you void a check and the period isn't closed, it will get rid of that prior period activity.
Right.
It's just gone.
I was going to mention that. We see that, and it creates some roundabout discussions. Sometimes we'll be provided a report or a check listing for a fiscal year, and then look at it the same date range again later, and all of a sudden something's changed. A check is missing. It's gone. There's less of them, and sometimes we don't know where to look because the historical data is removed.
And then once it's removed, it's gone.
Right.
So we can't stress enough to use the diocese accounts. We understand that every organization has different programs and they want to track those programs, but you can use different reporting segments such as classes or sub-accounts to track those. And ultimately, that will, using the sub-accounts, will roll up to the general account. It's going to make it easier for your school controller. It'll make it easier for your reporting because it'll be more concise.
Right. If you're a diocese that's listening on the line, and you don't already use a standardized chart of accounts, there's a lot of power in that, and that we have those discussions quite frequently, and articulating that to your greater community, your parishes and your schools on why you need that standardization, how it helps you accomplish your goals and do your job of running the diocese.
And if someone supporting your organization needs to access the information from a place besides yours, at home, at Starbucks, wherever, put those records in the cloud and have them access those records through the cloud rather than taking the physical paper. Once it's gone, there's no guarantee it's coming back. And as always, reconcile your high-risk accounts timely. Net assets, cash, AR, AP. A monthly close checklist will help immensely with this.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is a good topic as well that we haven't really mentioned yet. We try to provide a lot of these insights for you on what we see out there, and some opportunities for improvement or remediation of these deficiencies, but we also understand the resource constraints and we want to be practical. And so one way to be practical with some of these accounting recommendations is focusing on the areas of highest risk, the areas of most importance for your organization. Of course, cash being one of them, the bank accounts. If you need to implement some form of review, start with implementing review of the bank accounts and then work your way towards having that discipline to review liability accounts as well, and moving forward after that.
All right, and in keeping with our theme of a culture of control, record keeping is purely effort-based. Often we see contracts for tuition that are not available. We see inadequate personnel records. We see that the school does not maintain records to validate the tax identification number, or there are unauthorized check signatures associated with the bank accounts, and that the school does not have access to copies of canceled checks on its bank statements.
Yeah, a little bit more on some of these. The tuition contracts is an interesting one. We're in advancing technology times. Tuition contracts are often done online now. We do see some schools still using paper form contracts, and if you're doing that, absolutely need to retain those copies of the executed contracts within your records. When we see they are retained, frequently they're inconsistent. If you randomly pick a family, their contract's not there, but other families may be there. So we do want to see that discipline of consistently retaining those contracts. But even if the school has moved to an online-based tuition system, which is fantastic for the organization, we still encourage you to perform some level of review of that data and retain that review in your files. So maybe it's as simple as downloading a listing of all the families' tuition rates and all that related data, having the principal and the finance committee perhaps review that information, sign it, put a signature, a stamp, something to evidence it, because as Eric mentioned earlier, from our perspective, if there's no evidence that it happened, it may not have happened. So we do encourage that still to happen, even with the online tuition model. Personnel records is a significant one. I mentioned that earlier a little bit. The goal here is to protect the organization from a human resources perspective. We see this fairly frequently still with inconsistent personnel records. And as Dean mentioned, sometimes that's because the personnel records were originally opened 20 years ago, and it's hard to maintain consistently all the amendments to various documents. But we want to see the original Form I-9s for employment eligibility. We want to see W-4s. We want to see performance evaluation reviews in those personnel records, certifications, teacher credentials, retirement withholding elections. That's an interesting one that we've had discussions on before of, a school's teacher had a disagreement with the school on how much they were supposed to be remitting into their retirement plan from their paycheck. And when the school went back into the personnel records and we helped dig through that information, it couldn't be found. There was no documentation of the original election. So it becomes a he said, she said, who's right? And that's not a situation you want to be in. Having that discipline of maintaining those records will help. Voided checks is one we see frequently as well. If you void a check, it happens. You're running a business. You need to occasionally void a check for a misprint or if it isn't cashed. But we need to see the parish or the school keep that copy of the defaced check on file. Maintain a voided check folder in your vendor drawer and just file them away as you go. Because when we come in after the fact and look at checks that are voided within the accounting system and there's no evidence that it was defaced and voided, then it begs the question, was it used? Was it cashed? We need to go to the bank side to see if that check ever cleared. Maintain those voided checks.
Great, thanks, Mike. Next, we want to talk about cybersecurity.
Yeah, and this is a hot topic, right? Has been for a little while, continues to be a very hot topic. Cybersecurity, what are the risks? How can you protect yourself? There's a variety of ways, but we do see parishes and schools have significant opportunity to improve their cybersecurity plan. So, the first, just do you have a plan, right, Eric? I mean, some parishes and schools haven't thought about this yet, or they're perhaps relying on the diocese to implement a diocesan-wide plan, but we're seeing no plan at all.
Well, to that, I would say, a plan makes it sound like it's robust. It doesn't have to be the first year. Come up with the 3 or 4 things that are most important to your organization that you feel are most vital to the security of your information, and put those on a one page and post it. It's
Right.
just highly visible. And you can always make it better.
And again, like we alluded to earlier, reach out to your board, your community at large. Undoubtedly, there's a parent or a board member who has an IT background who can assist with this. They just haven't been asked, or they don't know that you need help with that. So moving on from that, what about weak passwords, Eric? Or maybe passwords is the wrong word to use.
Yeah. Some time ago, someone said, hey, have a password, 8 to 16 characters, use capital letters, numbers, special characters, and you're good. Well, they did some studies and they found that it takes these bots about 3 hours to crack a password that is 16 characters or less with special characters. What they're saying now is not to use a password, but to use a passphrase. Use spaces, which feels really weird to have a space in your password, but take 3 words that don't mean anything to each other and put them together, and that's your new password. So Toyota, bunny, water. It doesn't mean anything. No one's going to guess it. They say, these are models at this point, but they say if your passphrase has 24 characters, it'll take up to 500 years to crack it. So what's great about that is that you don't have to remember the special characters and numbers. It is harder because it's longer. So what they're saying now is instead of changing your password every 30 days or 90 days, do it much less frequently, do it annually, because you've got that security with that long, high character passphrase.
Yeah, that's great. And so even once you've set up that new passphrase, hopefully, and replaced passwords, haven't you seen these are shared within the organization? Maybe they're posted somewhere, kept in a drawer.
I have the vision of walking into an office and seeing a computer monitor that's framed by Post-its with passwords. It has the software, the web page, the username, and the account password. Obviously, that's not going to work. What we're seeing, there's a software that will only allow you to have one password or one account, so people will share it. We see that with certain bank accounts. They'll only give you one online account, but you just can't share those accounts.
Yeah.
What we're seeing people use now is a password management tool such as LastPass. It's less than $30 a year per user. It maintains all of your passwords for you. It allows you to have highly complex passwords because it remembers them, and you just have to maintain that one password for your password management tool.
As a single sign-on, right? Use that one password, and then it implements your other passwords to the relevant sites.
Yeah, it's effectively single sign-on that integrates with your browser.
That's great. Now, how about when employees leave? Of course, we don't want that to happen. It's unfortunate, but when they do, sometimes it's forgotten that they have access to sensitive data, right?
That's correct. So not only remove them from your bank account, but remove them from the online account and your accounting software. So the recap for these is use that security plan, have regular employee training, coach them that not to use password is not a good passphrase.
Yeah, that's great. And the password management tools are always effective, as we alluded to, and sometimes it's viewed as an expensive, additional burden for the organization. But there's plenty of new tools out there that are extremely cost effective. But again, we want to see you all see the parishes and schools just start thinking about this. Take baby steps, gain some momentum, and start implementing greater cybersecurity.
And checklists are always great because often employee departure involves not only accounting, HR, and IT.
Okay, we're going to go to our third polling question. Again, we'd love to get your response so you can get that CPE credit. So the question is, what aspect of improving internal controls do you find most challenging? We don't have enough volunteers. We need more training. We don't know where to begin. None of the above. And when you talk about volunteers, you mean like members of the board and that would help with the internal controls? Is that what we mean by that question?
Board members, parishioners,
Okay.
parents at the school.
Great. Okay.
As a fellow board member, I would say get out even more outside the organization, definitely.
Yeah. Okay. Great. We're going to give you a couple more seconds to answer that question. And with that, we'll go ahead and close the poll. Thank you.
Great. So about what, a third maybe are itching for more volunteers, and a third need more training. Hopefully this helps with some of the training. As we'll finish off here in a few minutes. We'll have some takeaways for you, maybe some tools you can take back and brainstorm as a group or with your board or committees. One of which is a great summary right here. This page really recaps a lot of the common findings we see and some of the opportunities for improvement at parishes and schools. And you know, if you really just started with this one page and checked off the ones that you already do and those that you need to implement, you're way ahead of your peers and making great progress and gaining some momentum. Once you accomplish all of these, you know, you can move on and get a little deeper, continuing to strengthen internal controls. So the common question that we hear from parishes and schools when we talk about these, when we come in and review their internal controls, their financial records is, well, where do we start? You gave us a lot of good information. We have a lot of ideas of how to implement and strengthen our organization, but what do we do first? And we try to help prioritize that for schools and parishes that we talk with. As we mentioned before, you know, take the easy wins. And momentum is huge. Some just don't know where to start, so they stall out. And we really encourage you to start tackling those that are really easy. Maybe it's the passphrases, you know, maybe it's the using ink on count sheets, something that's very quick and easy to implement. Start doing that, and you can move on to the larger tasks. You know, long-range budgeting takes some time. It takes some effort from a group of individuals, and that may be a little bit lower on the priority. But first and foremost, highest priority by all means is cash. Whether you're the parish or a school, we really want to see them protecting your cash, implementing those proper internal controls to both prevent fraud and detect any errors in the cash collection and depositing process.
Yeah, and prevent versus detect. Obviously, your cash controls are mostly going to be to prevent fraud, but those monthly reviews, the reconciliations, the reviews against your budget, against your trend are going to detect those intentional, unintentional errors. So you need a good mix of prevent and detect controls. And then use your resources. You've got a diocese auditor, you've got a diocese school and controller, and your board and finance committee. This is not a single person effort. It should be a large structured effort. Use all your resources.
Okay, and with that, we're going to go to our last polling question. And so that is, which internal controls of the below area is most important to you? Cash, budgeting and forecasting, record keeping, and cybersecurity. And I actually have a cash story to tell. At our parish, the Faith Formation kids all did the rice bowls during the Lenten season, and the director of the program took a big bag of all these rice bowls and put it in her office, and that bag disappeared. So all the cash that the kids had saved throughout Lent was not given to the organization that they wanted to go to. So that was a cash control that was not in place. Just putting it in her office was not safe enough, obviously.
Sure.
It should have been deposited right away.
Yeah. As we're seeing these results come in, no surprise, cash, you all would agree is one of the most important areas for you. I know I've seen it at some parishes, you know, the live currency and checks are always deposited, and then the coins are kept in a bucket in the corner somewhere. And next thing you know, that bucket turns into a 50-gallon drum, and there's a lot of money in there, and it's, you know, sitting, waiting to get deposited. But that's not obviously a good control. There's opportunities to improve something like that.
And once it is deposited, cybersecurity will keep it safe.
So what's next? You know, we talked about prioritizing. You know, I think doing a self-assessment is always great, whether that's an outside provider coming in and taking a look with third-party eyes, or you doing it on your own with some of this information we shared with you today. You can easily take a hard look inside your organization, identify those easy wins. We have a self-assessment questionnaire that you can use if you'd like. By all means, reach out to us after today's discussion, and we can share that questionnaire with you to self-assess. We also have a cybersecurity document that you can download to share within your organization on what to do next. But take that information, take what you've thought about today to your next board meeting or finance committee meeting, start the discussion. That's step one. Start the discussion on how you can start implementing changes.
Okay, and with that, we're going to have our Q&A session here at the end. The first question I wanted to reach out to the panelists with is there a recommended record-keeping timeline for parishes and schools?
Yeah, we get that question fairly frequently, and Eric can chime in if he has a different opinion on it. First, I always like to look to the diocese. If your diocese has a policy in place, that should be where the parish or school should start. If that's also part of the question of they don't have that policy yet, I always err on the side of 7 years. Just hang on to everything for 7 years. That being said, if you want to be more refined or if you're running out of space, there's the IRS has good guidelines on some documents can be retained for 3 years, some for 7 years, and other more organizational level documents retained in perpetuity.
And again, leverage the cloud. If you've got new documents, you can scan them and keep them as long as you like without incurring the facility expenses.
Okay, and then we do have a couple of people have asked if they can get copies of this presentation. So yes, just to let everyone know, you will receive a copy of all the slides and a link to this recorded webinar in a couple of days.
Yeah, and the link, excuse me, the link is going to be important just because, and we know that we put a lot of imagery on the slides and a lot of the detail is going to be behind it. But if you want to specifically talk about some of the detail, please reach out to us. There was an interesting question on if we would share why families choose Catholic school education for their children and the top 3 reasons. And what we have seen in our experiences of what our diocesan schools tell us is, number one, it is that desire for a faith-based, stewardship-based education for their children. Number 2 is that quality education, and then quickly followed up by number 3, which is that that sense of community and that family feel. So those are the top 3 things that our diocesan schools really tell us are the draws that help them increase and keep that enrollment high.
Yeah, and I would agree with that. For myself personally, I have a second grader and a kindergartner at a parish school, and for us, we started as parishioners, and then once our kids were of age, we easily continued our involvement with the community there by attending the school for many of those reasons that Dean mentioned, but overall enhanced our involvement with that greater community.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Mike, Dean, and Eric. Great presentation. Again, if any of you'd like to reach out directly to one of our presenters, their contact information is there. Dean's got a great social media face out there, so make sure you follow him on all of those opportunities, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And thank you for joining us for today's webinar. Again, you will get your CPE certificate and a link to this presentation in email in the next couple of business days. Thank you. Bye.